And everyone has spoken truth with feeling, with clarity. And Emmanuel, I've left you for last, because privately I call this the How Dare You Summit. How dare you?
Now, as black people, it is very rare to always find black leaders standing up and talking to the Western nations and telling them enough of your control. But currently, we are seeing a trend where black leaders are standing up against Western nations and telling them that you have controlled us enough, you have taken advantage enough of us, and for now, allow us chart our own path of having self-determination and control of our own destinies. In today's video, we are going to listen to one leader who I really like. She is the Prime Minister of Barbados, Motley. She was speaking at a conference where Western nations gathered to talk about climate change. And what I want you to focus on is how bold the Prime Minister was when speaking in front of Emmanuel Macron and other world leaders at this event. Let's watch this, then come back and share some thoughts together.
We come to Paris today not to reinforce the divisions of the past, the orders of the past, but we come to Paris to identify the common humanity that we share and the absolute moral imperative to save our planet and to make it livable. We don't need a lot more words today. And quite honestly, I don't know that I have it in me to give more words. As I speak to you, my country, that of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and others in the Caribbean, in the Eastern Caribbean, are under a tropical storm watch for Tropical Storm Beth, literally. Yesterday, I had to decide whether to stay or to go. And I chose to stay because it is important that we move to action. Behind Tropical Storm Beth is another system, and hence, this is our new reality. We have heard this morning from Vanessa, we've heard from The Economist, we've heard from the President of Niger, and everyone has spoken truth with feeling, with clarity. And Emmanuel, I've left you for last, because privately I call this the How Dare You Summit. How dare you? How dare you upset the order? How dare you step out of your crease and summon us all to this inflection moment that will determine whether we will have the capacity and the will to bring pace and scope to the problem. I can tell you that there has been movement. Yes, 9 months ago, no one was speaking about natural disaster clauses. Now we have people wanting to recognize the wisdom of it, because countries do need to pause debt payments if they are going to house and feed people who are victims of a climate crisis. Doesn't quite work as well for those who have to move people who are suffering from drought, as the president of Malawi has had to do. So we need to perfect it. 9 months ago, no one was talking about multilateral development bank reform at scale. And Ajay, the World Bank was not as forceful in its commitment to the crisis of climate as it is now. And we wish you all the best, because in your hands lies the need for pace and scope. 9 months ago, We were not prepared to discuss issues of debt. And Kristalina, when no one else was stepping up during the pandemic, yes, you led the way, recognizing that your duty was not only to deal with the symptoms of the balance of payments problems, but to go back to the treaty and its underlying objective of securing growth and macro and financial and economic stability. But what is required of us is not simply to mark a card for progress. As we heard from Vanessa, what is required of us now is absolute transformation and not reform of our institutions. And that transformation is required because while the world knew since the 1890s that we were facing the warming of the climate, we chose not to heed the advice of scientists. And that which could have been done in more than a century is now being reduced to be done in less than a decade. And Secretary General, my heart bleeds for you, because yours has been almost that constant voice in the wilderness. But I say to you that it has not been in vain. As you heard from President Macron this morning, there is now the beginning of the understanding that poverty and climate cannot be separated, that education and climate cannot be separated. And later today we will go into the details of what that action must look like, much of which we have put in the Bridgetown Initiative, not because we believe we have the answers alone, but simply because we had the will to pull people together and say, let us discuss these issues and let us make enough noise consistently to command the attention of those who must speak and who must act. I ask us today not to leave Paris without understanding that the bolstering of the political ambition that is required must secure transformation and not reform. And I ask us to ensure that those of us who are heads of government and heads of state recognize that the world cannot continue in the shadow of an old imperial order that does not see countries, does not feel countries, does not hear countries, and worse, does not see, feel, or hear people. I ask us today to recognize that we cannot come to Paris but let our directors go back to the IMF or the World Bank and it be business as usual. They do not act in their own interests. They act on behalf of our sovereign states. And that is why we speak not only to the need for money, we speak to the need for the reform of the governance systems. Because when these institutions were founded, our countries did not exist. And we speak for a complete transformation of securing the sources of capital, as unpopular as it might be to voice it. We do not ask for the bankruptcy of private companies. That's not our wish. But we do ask for everybody to share the burden so that we can share the bounty. And it therefore means that simply relying and holding only governments accountable has run its course. And what is necessary now is for us to bring to the table also multinational corporations whose balance sheets dwarf more than 2/3 of the world's states. That is the world we have created out of the last century. And if we don't recognize that they cannot be left out of the equation, I'm coming. If they don't recognize that they cannot be left out of the equation, then we have no desire to solve the problem. And we thank philanthropy for what they do, but it can't only be what they like. It has to be what the world needs. And I hope that we leave Paris, therefore, not only secure in our determination to protect the planet, to protect the biodiversity, to protect people, but to recognize that if we do not act today at scale, with pace, we will not be able to get there in time to save more people. Let us, as the representatives of our people, at this most unique time in the history of civilization, not only do the right thing, but do it in time and do it for the right reasons. We will have more time in the next day and a half to discuss the details. But my plea simply now is to step up the pace and let's get going. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Première ministre. Pour conclure cette cérémonie d'ouverture.
Now, that is some boldness there. I think Mia Motley is always very, very brave in terms of how she's addressing issues affecting specifically black people. You know, our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean have really been forgotten in many aspects. When you find people talking about issues affecting blacks, they kind of sometimes try to avoid talking about our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean. But I like how Mia Motley speaks out. She has really put her point across and pinpointed out Emmanuel Macron and told him, how dare you? Now we know on issues climate change, these Western nations have always taken advantage of our African nations and even our black people, because if you look at the net emitters, the people who emit huge amounts of greenhouse gases, it's not in Africa, it's not in the Caribbean, but they are the Western nations, Europe, China, and the United States. So we have really to be fair when dealing with these issues. When we talk about policies that help in reducing climate change effects to people living in developing countries, this is a serious issue that I think Western nations are not really serious about it. They are the net emitters, yet they don't want to really take up what they should. So I did some little research here that I want to share with you. Here's what I found out. Western nations have historically taken advantage of developing countries in the context of climate change by imposing global environmental policies that often prioritize their own economic interests while neglecting the needs and realities of poor nations. This exploitation is rooted in the historical responsibility of developed countries for the majority of carbon emissions and their reluctance to support meaningful climate action in the developing world. So you see, Western nations are the lead emitters of carbon emissions. But when it comes to taking steps and responding to policies that help in curbing these emissions, they seem to be sleeping on their job. This is what has angered Mia Motley, and that is why she's out there speaking about the impact of climate change on developing countries. And these developing countries are largely black-dominated. First, Western nations have benefited from industrialization and economic growth that contributed significantly to global greenhouse gas emissions. Despite this, they have often pushed for climate agreements that impose disproportionate responsibilities on developing countries. For example, while developing nations contribute less to global emissions, they are often pressured to adopt stringent environmental regulations that could hinder their economic growth, even through the lack of financial resources and technology available to wealthier countries. This approach places an unfair burden on nations that are already grappling with poverty, underdevelopment, and limited infrastructure. This is very, very true. You find that they are bringing stringent regulations that will hinder growth in Africa. For example, we are seeing this craze where developing countries are told to adopt use of energy that are environmentally friendly. For example, you are told to use wind and solar power. But one question that you should ask yourself, since when was an industry powered by solar or even wind energy? It's quite difficult for that. The industrialization we see in the Western nations did not happen because they were using green energy, but because they used the energy that they call dirty now. So Africa or even the Caribbean will not suspend their development to help Western nations eat their development. We have seen them use our resources and develop their countries. But when it comes to us, they're telling us, use solar power, use wind power, which cannot even run a motor in an industry. So I think these kind of policies are the ones that they have developed to ensure that developing countries continue remaining in their developing state without achieving any serious agenda. Moreover, Western nations have been slow to meet their commitments to provide financial support to developing countries for climate mitigation and adaptation. In 2009, developed countries pledged 100 billion US dollars per year by 2020 to help vulnerable nations address the impact of climate change. However, this promise have largely gone unmet, and when funds are provided, they often come in the forms of loans rather than grants, further indebting already struggling nations. This lack of adequate financial assistance hampers the ability of developing countries to invest in renewable energy, disaster preparedness, and other critical climate initiatives. So this is the thing that is happening. There has been this promise that was given to developing countries because it was seen that it would only be fair if countries were responsible for what they have emitted. So to help cover this disparity in emissions, it was agreed that developing countries that have not largely contributed to the emissions will be given 100 billion US dollars to help them in developing policies or even infrastructure that can improve their development and allow them attain the use of green energy through development that is in different stages. But you find that this commitment that Western nations have been making, they are not really meeting it up. They are not fulfilling their obligations. So they are leaving African countries, they are leaving Caribbean countries to really bear the brunt of climate change and disaster that come with it without even meeting up to what they agreed to really bring out. So these are also some of the areas where you find that Western nations are not paying up their fair share. And that is why Prime Minister Motley stood out and told the Western nations that you have taken advantage of us for quite some time, and it is time you make your word your bond. Additionally, the international carbon market system designed under mechanisms like the Kyoto Protocol allows wealthy nations to buy carbon credits from developing countries to offset their own emissions. While this might seem like a fair exchange, it often undermines the long-term development of poorer nations. Many of these carbon offset projects displace local communities, restrict access to land, or fail to deliver promised benefits. The short-term financial gains from selling carbon credits often do not compensate for the long-term environmental and economic costs faced by developing nations. This is very true. And I think as an African, I've seen these issues of carbon credit market being implemented in my country. The countries like Saudi Arabia have come to Kenya and they're really taking up huge forests, buying them and offsetting their carbon credit as it has been demonstrated. So this always takes up some land. People who live in those areas are always told to relocate because this is a land that is being preserved for climate issues. But also look at this. When these lands have been taken up, what space will be left for African nations to develop? No space will be left. We will only be having those kind of forests and no concrete development will come. While it brings us some money, this money is often used in corrupt activities. So you find African nations staying behind because of these kind of issues. So in global climate negotiations, developing countries frequently advocate for climate justice, arguing that those who have contributed the most to the problem should bear the brunt of the solution. However, Western nations continue to resist ambitious climate goals that would require them to cut emissions more rapidly, perpetuating a system where developing countries face the greatest environmental consequences despite having the least responsibility for the crisis. This imbalance exemplifies how developed nations have surpassed meaningful climate actions to maintain their own economic and geopolitical advantages. This is very true. And that is why Prime Minister Motley has gotten out and is very furious to these Western nations who continue taking advantage of developing countries while still going through with their emissions and sustaining development in their countries without considering what developing nations like those in Africa and even in Caribbean are going through. Tell me down in the comment section what you think about this. And if you're watching us for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and also share. Thank you, and may the good Lord bless you. Goodbye.